Hello fellow history lovers and welcome back to my channel. My name is Philippa Lacey Brewell from British History Tours, and if you love British history then you are definitely in the right place. Please make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so that you get notifications when I upload a new episode. Also, please give me a thumbs up and comment below if there is something you particularly enjoyed or something you think I missed or something else you'd like to see me cover. I'd love to know your feedback. So this week we are covering events that happened between the 27th of January and the 2nd of February. Now, a lot happened in this week, so I'm not going to cover it all because it would take forever, and you know, I need to leave myself something to do in subsequent years as well, no? So this week there's quite a lot of Tudor history going on and also a lot around the English civil wars. We have the death of Henry VIII, we have the burial of his first wife Katherine of Aragon, and we have that on the same day that his second wife Anne Boleyn miscarried. So we will definitely be talking about those events. Also, on the same day in history, you have the execution of Charles I and the posthumous hanging and beheading of Oliver Cromwell. So that certainly needs to be covered. Also, the Beatles did their Rooftop concert, and at the end of this video I'm going to provide a link to another YouTube video which shows that concert, because it's just fantastic still even today. This week I'm going to try it a little bit differently. I'm going to just talk to you. Like if you follow me on Facebook, you'll know that I do my live videos and there's very little editing involved, and you get all my tangents and my and my, I think I say so a lot and I think I say now a lot, so I apologise already for that. So we're going to have a go today. I'm going to talk to you about the events that happened in this week in British history, and if I make mistakes, so be it, I will correct them. And anyway, let's get started. On the 28th of January 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall, and to be honest I think he's probably going to get enough attention today, this week. So what I want to do is talk about in more detail the events which happened to his first two wives in this week in history. Because the links between them are very interesting. His first wife, Katherine of Aragon, had died on the 7th of January at Kimbolton Castle, where she had been after she had been made to leave the English court. And she wasn't well. We don't really know why she died. You know, the medical knowledge, of course, at the time wasn't the same as today, but also the records that they kept. Even modern doctors and people in the medical profession would have to, or do have to, try and pick through what information is there and try and make a diagnosis, which, you know, I'm sure diagnosing things is difficult enough when you've got a patient in front of you, but when you've got 500 years gap and no patient in front of you, it must be very difficult. So we're not totally sure how Catherine died, or why, what caused Catherine's death, but she was about 50 years of age. And she died on the 7th of January. Now this is 1536. 1536, for anyone who is an Anne Boleyn fan, will know that 1536 was also the year that Anne Boleyn died. And actually these women, Henry VIII's first and second wives, died within 5 months of each other, or just over 5 months of each other, sorry, with Anne Boleyn being executed on the 19th of May. Now, when Catherine died on the 7th of January, she was buried on the 29th of January at Peterborough, when it was Peterborough Abbey at the time. It since became a cathedral because we're just before the dissolution of the monasteries at this point. And Peterborough Abbey was actually dissolved in 1539, and it was created by letters patent from Henry VIII. It was created into a cathedral in 1541. So Katherine of Aragon is buried now at Peterborough Cathedral, was Peterborough Abbey. On the same day she was buried, Anne suffered another miscarriage, and I say another because she had a miscarriage that we know about in 1534. This miscarriage was probably, by her own reckoning, she was about 3.5 months pregnant, and it, although maybe not on its own, it was part of a cascade of incidents and things that happened, worries in Henry's mind. Goodness knows what's going on in Henry's mind a lot of the time, but that led to Anne falling out of favour with Henry very quickly, and obviously ultimately, anyway, she was executed in May, which we will cover obviously in other subsequent videos. But I think it's very interesting to look at the link between these women. Not only are they Henry's first and second wives, but I think Catherine can sometimes become a bit of a footnote to Anne's story. But I do wonder how many realise that they died within a few months of each other. Catherine had been sidelined, if that's the right word, in favour of Anne about 6 years prior, and Anne herself at this time was finding that she was becoming only one of Henry's love interests again, because it's around this time that Anne mentions for the first time that Henry's attentions are turning to another, and she sort of says, I can't cope with it like maybe Catherine could, because I love you so much more than she did, and I just can't bear the fact that your attentions are turning to another. And that other was of course Jane Seymour. So 29th of January is significant for Catherine and Anne. It was Catherine's burial at Peterborough Abbey, and it was the day that Anne had her final miscarriage. And this is all in 1536. You can go and visit the tomb of Katherine of Aragon, which I did actually only a few days ago, because they have a Katherine of Aragon festival at Peterborough, at the cathedral, every year to mark the date at which she was laid to rest there, which is fantastic. So if you ever get a chance to go over to Peterborough for that, it's always the weekend closest to the 29th of January, where they have events and services in commemoration of Catherine. I think it's really interesting when events that are linked somehow actually happened on the same day in history, maybe years apart. So last week we had the first representative parliament had met, and then a few hundred years, or about 400 years later I think it was, Parliament was trying Charles I. Well, we have another link. On the 30th of January, obviously not in the same year, but on the 30th of January, we have the execution of Charles I. He had been found guilty of treason by Parliament. He didn't recognise this Parliament, but he was found guilty and he was executed on the 30th of January. 12 years later, Oliver Cromwell, which you will know was the head, he became protectorate of the Commonwealth. He was posthumously hung and beheaded. So let me tell you a bit more about both of those stories. Charles I was executed 30th of January 1649. And he was executed outside, well, you can go to his execution site, and what I find fascinating about this every time I go, because I do a tour in Whitehall, and I love the fact, because it's not ironic, it's just interesting to realise that people are walking through the execution site of one of our kings, probably without realising it. Here we are at Banqueting House on Whitehall, the sun about to pop over the top there. It's here, 30th of January 1649, that Charles I was led out of a window now blocked up to be executed in front of a crowd. He was the reigning monarch, but he'd lost the English civil wars, and the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell had tried him for treason at the Great Hall in Westminster, just down the road from here, and had found him guilty. He was led out to a scaffolding around about the height of those first row of windows. The block on which he had to lay his neck was the small block, which meant that he, instead of other nobles who would have knelt to be executed, he had to lie down. It was another piece of humiliation on the part of the parliamentarians for Charles. It was different to how it looks now. So the gates, Holbein Gate and the other gate, the name I can't remember off the top of my head, were still in place. So actually you had almost a square, if you like, in that area that was packed with people who had come to watch. Why they were watching, whether they just thought this couldn't actually happen and were interested to see what was going to happen. I imagine there were people from both sides there, those wanting to see the king dead and those not. When he was executed, the sound from the crowd was like a groan. I imagine that did just happen, and a shock, and what happens now. He was executed at 2 p.m. and there is a clock on the top of Horse Guards Parade with the 2 blackened, and that is to signify the time at which Charles I was executed opposite, because Banqueting House and Horse Guards Parade is opposite. There's 2 stories about his shirts. He'd asked either for 2 shirts or for a thicker shirt that morning. We're 30th of January, so it's in the middle of our winter, and he did not want to appear frightened, so he didn't want to shiver, hence wanting a warmer garment to wear. And because Charles wasn't scared, I don't think, beyond obviously what was possibly human and uncontrollable, but he believed he was going to a higher place. He'd always believed in his divine right to rule, as his father James I had done. And actually, well worth mentioning, he had walked through Banqueting House, and Banqueting House, if you've ever been, and if you haven't, put it on your list, has incredible painted ceiling by Rubens, and it depicts James I on there, and Charles I had those paintings commissioned, so he'd had to walk under these paintings depicting his father in heaven to go to his own death. I think probably the most upsetting part of it is to read accounts of, and I'll put links into the show notes, but read accounts of Charles having to say goodbye to his children. I think that he from my understanding, he knew he was sort of being sacrificed, and I think he had a peace with that, because he knew it was it was greater than him, if you like. But saying goodbye to his young children really had upset him, as you would imagine. So that was 2 o'clock on the 30th of January 1649. Charles I is beheaded outside Banqueting House on Whitehall. After the execution of Charles I, Britain becomes a republic for the next 11 years, run by a man called Oliver Cromwell, a politician, a soldier, charismatic, a great leader. He was of the Puritan faith, and we saw a lot of destruction and defacing of tombs, cathedrals, anything they saw as idolatrous or for privilege. You know, they were against sort of hereditary privilege. and we see a lot of damage, including related to the story we've just covered about Catherine, including Katherine of Aragon's tomb at Peterborough Cathedral, which was destroyed, and her body luckily left alone, although they had moved the tombstone, I believe, to see if there was any jewels there with her, and there wasn't. But we see a lot of destruction. However, when Oliver Cromwell dies, Oliver Cromwell has a grand funeral and is buried in a grand tomb in Westminster Abbey. It's another story for another day, but well worth looking into if you are interested, because he basically became another monarch. I mean, monarch means the mono part of it is one. It's one person in charge. A monarchy is one person in charge, and he certainly seemed to take on the trappings. Windsor Castle, as an aside, sort of survives because he liked Windsor Castle, whereas other places, other castles, we have hardly anything remaining of them. After he dies, through a series of events, Charles II is requested to come back to Britain, and we have the restoration of the monarchy, and we have retribution. Those who signed the death warrant of his father, Charles I, were hunted down and executed where they could be. Any who could went into exile on the continent. But even those who'd already died in the intervening time couldn't escape. So Oliver Cromwell, along with two other bodies, were exhumed. They were exhumed on the 28th of January, and on the 30th of January they were pulled on a sled to Tyburn, as a live person would have been who was going to be hung there. And they were taken to Tyburn. They were hung on the gallows. Then their heads were removed and put on spikes outside Westminster, where they apparently stayed for the remainder of Charles II's reign, so about another 20 or so years. So even death didn't mean that Cromwell escaped some sort of retribution from his son. But he no longer has a tomb at Westminster Abbey. And another story that goes along with this, which is linked to the Whitehall area, and which I love telling, and I have another video on this, so I will provide the link to this. At the top of Whitehall, on a traffic roundabout, or I call it a roundabout, traffic island, is a statue of Charles I on horseback. Now, this statue apparently was created in the reign of Charles I, and it was somehow hidden and was later erected on this spot. But this spot has another link to all the events that happened here. So more of the people who signed that death warrant for Charles I were hung, drawn and quartered on that spot. So now Charles I is sat on his horse on that spot, looking down Whitehall, looking towards where he was executed. The last thing that I want to cover today, which I promised you at the beginning of the video, is the Beatles Rooftop concert. But before I give you the link to go and watch that, thank you very much for joining me again this week for This Week in British History. And please, if you want a daily dose of history, come along to my Facebook page or my Instagram, and you can find me there, British History Tours, or British_history_tours for Instagram. And I've put the links in the show notes, so you can come and find me there. Also, I have put links to my sources and also further reading, so that if you are interested in any of the topics that I've covered today, you can go and have a further read and delve into the topic yourself. But thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.